At least I have a timer this time.
I've seen you on this stage before.
Yes.
You know, it sounds like Grace Jones and Tango in Paris, but it's not. It's Tango in Belgrade. Anyways, welcome back to Belgrade.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
You were standing last time on the stage, as was I.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's an interesting perspective. I heard you like being very close to the audience.
I do like being close to the audience, yes.
Is it also valid for your musical performance when you perform or when you record and release your albums? Oh, there was an album that you released recently.
There was, yeah.
Oh, funny me.
More
How
of an
did
EP,
I know that?
but
Recently, like in August, like 2 months ago?
I can't. When was it? It was a couple of months ago, a few months ago. Yeah.
Cool. What kind of music is it?
It was 80s synthwave, which I don't know how popular that is these days, but I thought it would be fun to play with some synths and stuff. So just a few songs on that.
Awesome. 80s are the classics. You know, after that, people stopped.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Okay. Let's not go there. Good. So, what will you be telling us today?
So we're going to be talking about context a little bit more, although Cesario and Nigel managed to do half my slides for me, so we'll see how I go with some of the timing and everything, because I rejigged my slides. So at least this time I have a timer. Last year I didn't have one. I'm probably going to miss it again this year, but we'll see how it goes.
So we welcome you here next year again.
Yeah, I could do half now and like half next year or something.
Awesome. And because Cesario is not here, we can bitch about him. He also stole my exercise for networking.
Oh, really?
You know, I swear to God, he must have overheard me in the backstage, and then he was like, Pedja, be my witness. So I'm like, I'm going to do the audience. I'm going to ask them to turn around and speak to the person they don't know. And the guy pops up on the stage and does the same thing before I had a chance to do it. But okay, I let him leave Belgrade. You know, I was not that upset. Good. Is there anything you would like to share with us, or anything that we should know? Oh, do we want to have a quiz game?
Well, we did it last year. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, but like a different question. Do we do the brutal and the macabre? Or the pretty and, I'm going to give you a hint already, sunny and that sort of game?
I'll leave the choice to you. You can pick.
Okay, we do the brutal.
You pick.
So the sunny and the nice one is that Chris is all packed, right? And moving to an amazing destination. Oh, come on.
Definitely moving, not all packed.
Okay.
Not all packed, but yeah, we're getting there.
And the destination is? Oh, we are invited, obviously.
Philippines. Yeah, I've decided working from a tropical beach has more appeal than working from the UK for some reason. Just seems a little more appealing.
So the tropical beach in the island of? Is it an island?
Boracay Island.
Boracay Island.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's got good infrastructure, but it's 7 kilometers long and it has white beaches and stuff. Definitely visit the Philippines if you haven't. It's pretty good.
Right. Good. And the other thing, okay, we're going to ask it in the end, the brutal and the macabre thing.
Okay.
So yeah, and whoever guesses it, what will they get? Think about it and you will tell us.
Okay.
So your time will run there, 50 minutes, and then let's plan the 10 minutes for the questions from the audience. And yeah, please do ask the questions. The floor is yours.
Cool. Right. Does that seem dark to everyone, or is it just me? It's pretty dark. It probably is just me. My eyes are getting old. If we could get that a little bit brighter, that would be awesome. But I don't know. Maybe I'll check with the engineer. 1 second. Can we get the screen a bit brighter? Oh, okay. Okay. So, hi everyone. Very pleased to be back again. Very nice to be back in Belgrade. So, as I said, although some of the stuff I was going to talk about has been mentioned by a number of other people, which is, perfectly understandable because there's a theme to a lot of what we're talking about. I think we can probably explore context a little bit more and talk about why it's so critical. I'm going to see if we can actually see what's... coming up on the screen. There we go. Okay. So I've always liked this picture. Context is the situation within which something exists or happens. I think Nigel had a description of context, a more dictionary, perfect description of it yesterday. But it also helps explain that situation or where we are. So I find this an interesting picture for a number of reasons. Obviously, this is not a particularly fair interview requirement. But why is this even a measurement? How did this come about? Who is it for? Does the bird have an unfair advantage here? Why is a human asking these things of animals? Can he even climb the tree? Who knows? But it highlights why the context and the why is very important in things. And obviously this also applies to things like education and so on, where we put everyone in the same place and focus on things like metrics and not learning outcomes, which significantly differ individual to individual. So context is a very important thing in complex systems, human systems. So I'm going to start with a little story. It's kind of a story of modern business. So there's a young automotive engineer from Detroit called Ernest Haraway, and he travels to Italy to see the greatest innovative car inventor in the world, Maestro Bellini. He's this genius. His inventions have defined progress in cars in all areas for decades. And he's now an old man. So this is his hero, right? He wishes to kind of return a radiator cap which fell off a car during a race and hit his father. And he turns up, and the man's very ill, and he's denied entry by the family, but he eventually gets in and he meets Maestro Bellini. And they talk about the history of his cars, and then the maestro says, look, I've created my last car, I'm dying, basically. And he takes Haraway to see it, and this car is incredible. It has these incredible curves. It's completely made of aircraft-grade aluminium. It has magnetic brakes, a free piston turbine engine, a battery which never fully discharges and charges very, very quickly, completely new technology, no unsprung weight. All of these things are supposedly impossible, but this genius has created this car. And so the implications for racing, for safety, for sports cars, for the advancement across the entire industry are just incredible. It's world-changing. So this car not only fits the context in the modern world and the need to be better and the new requirements, but it redefines that context across the board. So Haraway is nearly in tears, and he says, look, the world deserves this car. And he can ensure that it's produced handmade, limited numbers, exactly like this prototype, and it can be used as a basis for advancing cars everywhere, benefit all of mankind. Bellini's very ill, and he says, take the car, give it to the world as it is. So after he's died, the world is better because of his work and his genius. The car is his gift to everyone. So Haraway takes the car, and it is everything he expected. It is the greatest car in the world. He's quite cautious. So the first time he accelerates, the car only goes to 160 kilometers in 4 seconds. He's being careful. It corners like it's stuck to the ground. It's just this unbelievable, incredible machine which has never been seen before. It has no equal. And as he drives, he says, thank you, Bellini. I will bring this to the world as it is. This is the greatest car that's ever existed. Of course, we can't really use aluminium for the body because we've kind of got a lot of steel plate we have, and we've got the dies to press it. And honestly, if we use aluminium and it doesn't corrode, then how are we going to sell a new one in 10 or 20 years? And we kind of can't redesign all our equipment for the new car. And the new engine type. So, we've spent millions on machines to create these engines, so maybe we just take a stock model and, and we'll rejig that to make it work. Oh, and, magnetic brakes. I mean, groundbreaking, never been done before, but that's going to be very expensive to test. It's going to be very expensive to certify. So probably we'll just use what we kind of already have And that should hopefully be good enough. The battery, world-changing, better than anything Tesla's got. Okay, that's great. But we have contracts with battery suppliers at the moment. We don't want to compete with that. We don't want to break those contracts. So it's okay, that at least the body will be the same on the car, mostly. I mean, it's quite unique. We might need to change the design in line with our marketing expectations and what we think the customers want. So it's just easier, it's more convenient, it's better all round to do what's always worked for us with these other cars. So, we've already done this. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, right? But nevertheless, he thinks, I'm making the old man's dream come true, and I'm bringing to the world the car it needs and deserves. This is unique, it's game-changing. This is a story by a writer called Harry Harrison in a book called Prime Number. It's a very short story. It's really, really good. I recommend you have a look at it. And it's a really brilliant allegory for modern business in a number of ways, but it also shows how we insist on taking a case-based approach into a context that it's not necessarily appropriate for. Haraway hasn't done this, by the way, because he's a bad person, right? He's kind of doing it with the best of intent. This guy is his hero. He thinks he's doing the right thing. He's taking what he knows and what he's always done. He's ignoring the context and the purpose behind the car. He's pandering to preference, to convenience, rather than the outcomes required in reality. So we take these things which need careful consideration and exploration, and we use, and I'll come to this a little bit later, this low-cost energy pathway to make decisions. And this impacts how effective we really are in organizations, as leaders. It affects things even down to profit capability, all the things that people in business, care about. But why is this? So I just want to kind of cover, obviously we're talking a lot about agile here, so I'm going to be talking about context in relation to not just business, but agility and agile. I think there are two important things. Now, any of these slides, by the way, that have a lot of text, don't waste time trying to read all of them. I'll talk around them. The slides will be available afterwards, so you can always read them in your own time. But I think it's important to remember that agility and resilience are two sides of the same coin. They're both very important. They're both twinned. And agility really is the ability to change, to repurpose what you have, and to respond with the appropriate speed and grace for the system. That's kind of what agility is about. And when you look at the resilience side, you've got the ability to detect weak signals. Now, I know that's been spoken about. I think Nigel mentioned those yesterday as well. Kind of detecting what might be coming. If you can't avoid things that are coming, which you need to avoid, you can recover quickly, and if you can recover quickly enough, you can exploit the new paradigm that exists, right? So these two concepts, I think, are very important, and both of them require context because they are reactions, they are things that happen in relation to other things. Okay, so context is a very important concept when we're doing anything to do with agile, agility, and so on. So I have another story for you, and this is the story of a senior agile coach from Shell. I gave a talk a little while ago, and it was a bit of a bait and switch. It was about scaling agile, which obviously I know will immediately trigger Nigel, because you can't. But I was actually talking about the fact that agile and agility aren't really that different, although we've compartmentalized them and so on. And she said to me, your talk was very interesting, but it wasn't anything to do with agile. That's not agile. And I said, that's interesting. So what would you say agile is? This is a senior coach. She's been doing this a long time. And she said, agile came from software development. And I said, okay, so do you consider that agile is a construct that came out of an industry? Or would you consider that software development was made more agile? And she said, it's a construct that came out of the industry. I think that's very interesting because that then probably plays a lot into what John was talking about, which is this idea of fake agile, which is it is a thing, it's a religion, it's a construct that's come out of the industry rather than our attempt to make things more agile, which means that they can react appropriately to their system, right? They can get better. So I know this isn't the Agile Manifesto. I didn't want to put another picture of it up. So I went for a slightly different guide, which I quite enjoy, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But I think Nigel called it a philosophy. We have principles, we have values. But for me, the manifesto is kind of, it's like a guide. It's like, look, here's some stuff you might find useful. See what you think, see how it works. It's a philosophy, it's a guide. It's not a Bible. It's not an instruction manual. And I think that is where probably a lot of the kind of the fake agile or the wrong kind of idea of agile as a construct maybe has come from. So I need to point out that this is not a picture of Alistair, although his LinkedIn profile picture does have some similarities in terms of the hair. But I was talking to him a little while ago, and you know, he was very insistent that agile is an attitude. And we were talking about this idea of agile and agility, and we both agreed this idea that agile is this rigid construct that's kind of taken the industry. And when I said, what's the real difference, Alistair, he was like, dude, they're the same damn thing, because he gets quite passionate about these things. And then when we talk about things like, this is interesting, again, Nigel touched on this yesterday, the idea of a mindset. I find it fascinating that we talk about growth mindsets and being able to change and adapt with a mindset. Take the word mindset, and it kind of tells you what you need to know about it. Like, it's quite a rigid structure, ironically. The concept of attitude is more contextual. It's influenced usually by what's happening, and it's definitely more agile. So I really like the idea that agile is this kind of much more contextual attitude to things that are happening in real time. And of course, if you're doing something like Scrum or whatever, the whole point is you have periods during your sprints where you are assessing things, you're seeing if you're still going in the right direction. Are you in the right context? Are you doing the right thing? That's really, really important. And I think there are some good examples of this in reality. Now, this comes back to something in complexity theory in Kinevin, which, any of you are welcome to talk to me about, Nigel about, whoever here is au fait with complexity. And it's this process called exaptation. Now, you hear about adaptation all the time. Exaptation is this, as I mentioned before, repurposing of what we already have. Okay, so a really good example of that was superglue. Superglue was originally created to try to form new gun sights in World War II, interestingly. So it had a military origin. And obviously, it didn't really fit the context. So nothing was really done with it until about the 1950s, and I think it was about 1951. Dr. Harry Coover, who's this gentleman on the left, realized the correct context for superglue while they were looking at it as a coating for aircraft canopies. They were trying to see what they could do with it. And they put two prisms together to see what would happen when light passed through it, and then they couldn't take them apart. So they panicked because this was expensive equipment. It was like $3,000 in 1950 or whatever. And he said, well, hang on, this has another application, right? The context is different than what we think. And so this process of exaptation we took, and Viagra is another example, which I won't go into, but it's another example of something built for one purpose and then used for a completely different purpose. It's now become superglue, and even superglue itself was exapted slightly again. I think it was the Vietnam War, but where there were terrible wounds and people needed to close them quickly, and they couldn't do it quickly enough to save lives, and they used superglue, and it turns out superglue is really good at sealing wounds. So there's now a medical type of superglue which doesn't damage your cells and so on. So this idea of flexibility and context, I think is really, really interesting. And there are many, many examples of this in business. So hopefully, I think we can agree that context matters. I've bought many sofas in my life, and most of them look like the top left, but they're not going to be very useful for me if I buy a house that has a curved area for a sofa. Buying the same type of sofa is not going to work. I need to understand the context within which I find myself to ensure that I'm going to have a purposeful fit. And that means, now I don't know how familiar people are with the OODA loop. Don't worry about trying to read all of this. I'll explain it much more simply. That means we have to understand where we are. Now, the OODA loop is quite interesting. Colonel John Boyd, US Navy Air Force, he kind of came up with the concept. And it's something that few of us are familiar with. But the basis of this is that we observe what is around us, we orient ourselves in multiple different ways, usually with biases and experience and a bunch of other things. We decide what we are going to do, and we act. That is something we do pretty much every second of every day. All organisms do it, even down to bacterium level. We're observing, we're orienting, we decide, and we act. And by the way, if you are interested in complexity, this bit that says Cynefin here, well, I've had some arguments with Dave over exactly where it fits, but Cynefin, understanding complexity, understanding decisions, how we make them, this is kind of a lens that fits over that orientation part. So it is crucial to observe where we are, to orient ourselves correctly so that we can effectively and accurately decide and act. And of course, this is all about context. It's all about understanding where we are in relation to other things. So let's have a look at that in a slightly more modern way. And we have a look at, I think, Nigel, you had the turn the ship around slide. David Marquet's work is really, really good. This is a fantastic book to read as well. And it's about language, obviously. The clue is in the title. But it defines this concept of blue work and red work. So traditionally in a company, you would have people thinking and telling other people what to do, and then those people go and do. Now, we know, especially in kind of the agile arena, that doesn't really work very well because the people doing the thinking and the commanding don't have the context and the understanding of what actually needs to be done a lot of the time. And again, Nigel's example of the CEO had never packed corn and was absolutely awful at it and didn't understand the issues is very apt. Right, because there's this divide, there's this decoupling, this distance. The context is not there for the people making the decisions, and that is a real problem. So one of the things that I think works very well is this idea of blue work, red work. Now this red, blue, red down at the bottom, Scrum is an example. It's not the only example, but it's a good example of this. Okay, so you think, you observe, you see where you're going, you double check things, you look at what you can improve, you do the thing, you get to the end of it, you review that, for want of a better word. Maybe you retrospect on what's happened and what you think you can do to improve, and then, I don't know, maybe you plan what you're going to do for the next one, these kind of things, right? So this idea of do something, but keep the doing quite short, and then put your head up like a periscope, because David Marquet was a submarine commander. You put the periscope up and you say, where am I? Am I still heading in the right direction? Is my context appropriate? You can probably see why case-based approaches do not allow for this. I'll talk a little bit about case-based approaches, but I have a better, more visual example of that. Business landscapes have been changing more and more rapidly for quite some time. And if it's changed that quickly, whatever we've mapped out before may or may not, whatever processes we've built, policies, governance, whatever we expect to be the case, however we've always done things, may or may not be appropriate for the context we're now in. So this gets more and more difficult, by the way, in the modern world. We have social media with fragmented narratives. We have business policies. We now treat estimates as a promise. Escalation of commitment, which is where if we say something, we have to do it, even if the context has changed. There are a number of issues with how we do business. And I think the idea of maps versus compasses really defines this very well. If you want to move somewhere and someone gives you a map, that map is perfect if the landscape is still the same. If the landscape has changed, not only is that exact pathway that you might take probably no longer accurate, the destination might not be there. You may not be able to close the gap between where you are and where you're going. You may not even be starting from where you think you are. So a map is effectively useless if the landscape has changed. Now, a compass is different. I can know that I need to move roughly north, and I can have a compass, and if I encounter an obstacle or something changes in my context, I can navigate around it while still roughly moving in the same direction. So the idea of a compass and navigation, wayfinding is something I talk about a lot. I think is much better than this idea of always mapping everything out. Maps don't really allow for context. Oh, I've jumped through a little bit more. So, does that mean we shouldn't map anything? Well, it depends on what you're mapping, right? If you go into an organization and you're trying to understand where things really are, and I know that there are a few people who argue with things like what counterfactuals really mean and so on and so forth, but if you can map these things within an organization, it's going to start giving you a pretty good idea of where things really are. This allows us to help sense the context. And so we map where we are, and then we use that to start exploring a direction, and that's where that kind of idea of the compass comes in. So this is different to a typical business mapping, roadmaps, that kind of thing. We start exploring inflection points in context, and then we start looking at, within those complex spaces, what we can then start testing, trying, moving, exploring, uncovering unknowns. So this isn't exhaustive, but if you kind of move left to right, this works pretty well, right? In general, this will help you lean, it helps you, with agile, it helps you with decision making, it helps you see where the information is, it helps with flow. I found this quite useful. And I think the two most important parts are here, decisions and intermediation and dependencies. So I've gone to many companies in my time, and I've said to them, I could make you agile. Making agile isn't a thing, but effectively, I could make you agile in 24 hours if you gave me the remit, the amount of authority. Do you think that they've ever given me that authority? They're never going to do that. But the way that you do it, it's very simple. If you want agility, you don't need a framework. Frameworks can be useful. I'm not saying never use them, but if you reduce decisions and intermediation, this is a vertical cost of delay. And if you reduce dependencies that don't need to be there, inside and between teams, you are reducing horizontal cost of delay. This goes back to what Nigel was saying about waiting, right? Non-value added work and waiting. So remove the decisions that you don't need, remove the dependencies that you don't need, and things become much faster. You've reduced your cost of delay, which actually costs businesses a hell of a lot. It just doesn't get factored into their immediate return on investment that they always look at. So this starts telling you, all of these things, if you map them, they start telling you what the context of the organization kind of really is. So this slide is a little bit different. It's still on the same theme, but I know that we've had quite a few people talking about culture as well and behaviors. And again, these things are highly contextual. Culture, I'm going to start on the right. Culture is effectively the shared behaviors that we are willing to accept. So culture comes from behaviors. Behaviors come from, over time, the beliefs that we create for ourselves. And those beliefs come from the experiences that we have over time. And the experiences that we have are largely, almost exclusively, I would say, a product of the environment that we are in. So what this is telling you really is that if you want the context to change, or you want to understand better how you can change things, and I'm trying not to use the word transformation as much as possible, you need to change the environment And then everything else over time will change. Nothing is quick with this because it is complex and it is human in nature. And that is the context of the change that we are talking about. And it's why case-based approaches are not particularly effective in organizations. The environment gives you effectively what are called affordances. It affords you certain things, and those will help shape your experiences, which give you beliefs, which dictate your behaviors, which emerge as a culture over time. So this is why the context of where things come from is critical, especially when they're hidden. In an organization, many of the things that happen are not because of what you see on the surface, they're actually hidden below. These are things called dark constraints and a bunch of other things. So when we talk about culture, this is quite an interesting one. I don't think I talked about this last year. I'll talk about it now. So culture is driven from the top down by leadership. It's quite innovative. You kind of drive something, you try and drive something new, right? So leadership are critical for driving that in an organization, but culture itself disseminates from the bottom up by the actions and interactions of people and teams, right? So it's kind of a more disruptive thing. But it is also defined, and this is a really important part, by the actions and inactions of leadership. It doesn't matter what they say. I'm sure you've all seen this, right? It doesn't matter what a leader says. We're going to do agile. And then the leader does everything but agile. So why would anyone else do agile? Like just because they're told to or whatever. It doesn't make a lot of sense. People do what they see leadership doing or not doing, not what they say. And that is dependent upon the model of legitimacy which exists within the organization. What does that mean? What makes you feel legitimate? It's not bad, by the way, necessarily. A model of legitimacy is how do you feel legitimate within the organization, within yourself? So if we don't change how people are made to feel legitimate, i.e. the context that they are within the organization culturally and in terms of incentive, reward, and so on, why would they change to a new way if they're being rewarded for staying in the old way? So this isn't the best, this isn't the best example of it or drawing of it, but I may have been tinkering with a few of these slides up to fairly recently. So the model of legitimacy essentially can be things like, how many people do I command? What's my job title? How much do I get paid? What are my rewards and incentives? Am I a key person in this company? Does everyone have to come to me for something? Does that make me important? How does that make me feel? What does it fulfill me in terms of my work? Do I hold all the information? Things like this. This is the model of legitimacy. So I want to talk a little bit about this. This is called the results pyramid. Again, you don't have to read all of this, but I'll call a few little bits and pieces out. So whenever we are moving towards a goal, a vision, an outcome, whatever it happens to be, we try to get some results from actions. That's one of the main things. And this is something that companies do all of the time, especially with transformations. And above the line, you have systems and structure. That's your roles, responsibilities, policies, rules, hierarchies, processes, ways of working. Now, I'm going to say this now. I'm tired of hearing ways of working. I don't like the term at all. Ways of working are not as important as we think. Ways of thinking are much more important. Because if you're a team and you're working in a certain way, let's say you're doing Scrum, and it kind of works well enough, but you realize you could improve, and you decide to adopt Kanban instead. You've changed your way of working. Does that mean that you're not delivering? Well, no, you're just changing the way of working appropriate to the context, or you're testing it to see if the context is different. So ways of thinking are much more important than ways of working, which can change quite radically if required, right? So that's something to think about. But anything above this line is what management and consultancies and transformations mostly look at. Below that line, we have the other parts which you need to address, and this is the context part, especially when you're trying to engender improvement and change within the organization, you need to have a look at where does that come from? Language and environment. How we use language is really, really, really important. It's kind of part of environment. And that gives us the experiences over time, as I say, which gives us certain beliefs, which long-term drives our actions. Short-term, we might change our actions if someone says do this, but long-term, our actions will not change if they go against our beliefs, which means the results you get, if you ignore the lower parts, are going to be other than you hope for. Right? So that's a really important thing to have a look at. So people and culture are led, systems and structures generally are managed. I think another way to look at this in organizations, and again, we're talking about the context here, is this idea of topography versus geology. The geology is the underlying structure, and it actually defines what is above it. But what is above it, the land that we see, signifies what is below it. So mostly when we react to stuff on the surface of the earth, we're reacting to what we see. What is up here is a symptom of what is down here. This is another way of me saying you need to find the fundamental issues, the real context within an organization, and address those fundamentals. Otherwise, anything else you do is likely to be wasted effort. And I've seen this again and again and again with organizations. It's a pretty simple slide. If you don't set those fundamentals, those foundations, you're effectively building a house, potentially on quicksand, right? You're not addressing what's going to make it sustainable, secure, solid. And unfortunately, very often, because when people say, here's a transformation initiative, they start looking at symptoms, ways of working, people in the teams. I want you to change what they're doing and how they behave. We're doing it from the wrong end, right? We're building the roof before we've built anything else, and there's no foundation for this. So I completely agree with Nigel, don't say transformations. In fact, if you ever say we are doing a change initiative, a transformation or whatever, the likelihood is it's going to fail. It causes a lot of behavioral issues and a bunch of fears and a whole load of other things. So just improve things where you can and keep improving them over time. And you'll find that actually that transformation, that change, the evolution, however you want to turn it, will start happening. So here are some of the reactions that we get to those symptoms. This should be familiar to a lot of people as well. This is a case-based approach to recessions, to problems in organizations, to funding issues, to not enough revenue and so on. This is what I like to call the spiral of woe. You get cuts, you tighten your policies, reshuffles and redundancies happen, then you start swapping out your management team for a new management team, then you get different fads and styles and what have you, and then that doesn't work. 3 years down the line, SAFe didn't work, so you're like, oh well, whatever, let's try something else. So SAFe version 6 with new team topographies or whatever the hell is in it now comes in with someone else and they've done it somewhere else successfully. And we know that case-based approach doesn't really work because you're trying to get a straight sofa for a round room, right? It may not be the right context. And that leads us on to kind of this thing I was talking about in terms of energy cost. So it makes sense to try to automate work, to try to lower the energy cost of things that we are doing. I mean, testing automation is a really good example of this, right? But we shouldn't ever try to reduce that energy cost of decision making. And I kind of mentioned this earlier when I was talking about intermediation and the dependencies and so on. So it's very good for work, but it's very bad for decision. So I don't know if anyone was in the intermediation and circles workshop that Nigel and I ran yesterday, but the idea behind the disintermediate or the intermediation exercise was to show that the information that gets passed back up the chain of management is reduced, it's summarized, and very often it's actually managed up. People have an agenda, right? They want to look after their careers, so they can actually dictate what people get to see. that makes it very hard for you to make an accurate decision. And people in positions of power, CEOs, COOs, whatever, have less time to make more decisions than they have before. And this is the wrong way around. If these decisions are critical and you don't have all the information, you need to spend more energy, get more data until you know you can have an accurate decision. And that's kind of how that works. The authority is here for the decisions, and then your information is here. Now, realistically, the role of somebody in charge, C-suite or whatever, should more be about coordination, communication, unblocking issues, those kind of things. They shouldn't really be there to tell everyone what to do. Strategic decisions, sure, right? But all the other decisions, the sign-off that goes down, you can see why there's a cost of delay. So there are two ways we can fix this, realistically. Number one, we can move more data to the authority and cut out the people in the middle. But even better, what do we always talk about? Move the authority to make a decision to the people actually doing the thing. That way, you are making a decision in context. You are making sure that you are doing the right thing. And this is the thing, it's not just enough to do the thing right, you have to do the right thing as well, and that's often the part that gets left out. And by the way, I'm not very popular in some organizations because one of the things that they say is, what can we do to make all of this better? And I say, remove the people in the middle and possibly just remove them because middle management, you don't need these people. And then I'm not particularly popular with most of those people. And this is one of the problems we have with these decisions. We think we make informed decisions. I've seen that on a few slides already. We think we make informed decisions, and actually, we use these first fit mental patterns. You've usually pre-decided something before you understand the context. Based on your past experience, your current experience, and your projected future experience. So this is really, really important. This is why it's really important to understand where you are. Now, I know that I have quite a few slides left, and I'm actually starting to drift nearer time, so I'm going to flick through stuff a little bit more quickly. That's Cynefin. I'll talk about that another time, but up at the top shows you your ordered domain. Down at the bottom is the complex area, and that's actually where a lot of organizations and all people are. You need to know which of these domains that you're in. You need to know your context to effectively make those decisions and move forward. And that's why this idea of case-based stuff is slightly problematic, because this is where frameworks come into it as well. Frameworks do two things really well. They define the shape of something, and they kind of define more or less the size. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But it's a constraint. What I prefer, what we talk about in complexity a bit more, is the idea of scaffolding. You create a structure which helps you develop your own architecture, essentially, your own building, that can take its own weight, that can have its own design appropriate to its context, and then you remove the scaffolding afterwards, right? So remember that a framework is always going to constrain you in terms of size and form. Does that mean that case-based stuff is terrible? Well, no. Like, if the context is the same, sure, use case-based stuff. But you need to know if the context is the same or not. And that kind of brings me on to the value streams I know Nigel talked about a little bit yesterday, and we've heard a bit more about as well. There's a reciprocal element to a stream of value. You have your upstream and downstream, and you're delivering the product, the value, whatever it is, but feedback gives you the context for what you are delivering and whether it is providing value. You do not know whether what you have provided has given value until you have the feedback from the customer. Value, ironically, is a valueless concept until you have had feedback. So feedback is very important. And we need to really think about this backwards again. The customer has needs and wants. They're not necessarily the same thing. They usually know what they want. They don't often know what they need. So what we should be doing is assessing those needs and wants, defining the outcomes that may meet those needs and wants, creating a workflow to get to those outcomes. Then we structure the teams around delivering that workflow, and then the organization, the CEOs, the whatever, unblock that so that it all works. Now, we know that's not how things work most of the time. We start here and go the other way. But if you do that right, you then are hopefully delivering exactly what they need, and then the customer gives you the feedback to tell you whether the value is delivered. Every time you run a review, this is basically, you're saying, did we deliver the value that was required here? So you're working very much in context. And that's why the idea of flow, I think, is really, really important. Flow adapts to the shape of things, but it also forms the shape of things. So flow, when you get flow right, it's pretty much always within context, in my experience. You know, if you're pushing too much pressure through the system, that's not really flow, and that's why we talk about pulling. When you have flow of water, for example, in pipes or whatever, it's flowing because of pressure differentials most of the time. And you unblock, you make sure there are no impediments, and the water just flows. That's what we should be doing for work as well. Having a big pump at the end that pushes everything through can break the system. So that's why we want to not go that route if possible. And then, of course, last year I spoke about FAD, FOMO. So you'll find that context gets broken a lot by consultancies and by hero leaders. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but people seizing fads that seem attractive or they have fear of missing out will very often take a case-based approach rather than look at where they are. And there's all sorts of stuff to do with vanity projects that go into there as well. So that kind of last brings me to the idea of there is no failure, there is only feedback. I mean, catastrophic failure exists. We'd like to avoid that if possible. I had some of that recently. But the feedback is just telling us what's there. That means we will always be in context. I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but the first Death Star had a catastrophic failure. They took feedback and they built another one which worked a lot better and didn't have the same weakness. They still lost it through management issues. We'll move on from that one. So, what can we do to approach things better? I always like to kind of end with some things that we can practically think about, apply, discuss, work on. Always gather all the information that you can. Don't cherry pick information. Gather as much as you can. Sense making is a very good way to do this. Look at patterns and trends, all of that kind of stuff. Talk to the people doing the work and listen to them. That's very important for the people up at the top. Ensure that agility and resilience are twinned emergent properties in the system. Move away from escalating commitment. If you promise something to someone and things change, go and talk to them about the things that have changed. Don't try to deliver what you've promised come hell or high water. Treat failure as feedback, as I mentioned. Mindfully avoid catastrophic failure. But smaller failure can be used for learning, so that's very, very important. Don't just rely on unbending policies and remove human accountability. A lot of HR in organizations does this, so we want to kind of avoid that. And don't just get into this low energy rut and just react to stuff and work on automatic. Decisions that you make, that the team makes, that executives make, always have to be high energy cost. Decisions should be high energy cost. Other work doesn't necessarily have to be. Value that curiosity, the queries, the not knowing, the ability to say, I don't know, even I was wrong. I mean, I'm wrong all the time about a lot of things, and it's important to be able to admit that because that's where we start understanding the context better and moving onwards. And lastly, use frameworks or tools appropriately. I'm not saying never use SAFe, never use Scrum, never use anything. These things can be useful in the right context, but it's better to use frameworks and tools to support what we need to do rather than predefine what we think we're going to do with them or by them. And I think that's pretty much it. So hopefully that made sense and kind of talked a little bit about why context is very important. You are always welcome to chat to me about it afterwards or grab me on LinkedIn or whatever. But it all links into everything that everyone else is saying here. So with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you to you. Very inspirational. I have a question before we start having the questions from the audience, which
Sure.
are not in the app, so we'll just do them with the
okay.
microphone. Yeah, we have other people who need to start, not just you. I really loved the quote that it's the feedback, not the failure. But how do you implement that in a culture that is sort of the East European or Southeast European, where the feedback is really, really, really hard to? I mean, it's very human to take bad news with a smiling face, but here it's sort of like, ultimate.
And it's not just here. There are many cultures that are concerned with appearing to not know something, appearing to get something wrong, especially like, for example, in Asia, you have the concept of face as well. And if you lose face, that's a very bad thing. So the idea is, what's more important? How can you make it more important to improve than to be seen to be wrong? So there are ways you can position it. You can say, okay, this has told me something. Now how can I use that to improve? That's a very polite way of saying, it didn't work, I got it wrong, I don't know. But it's always about seeking to learn more rather than being less. So the real failure, if you want to look at it this way, the real failure comes from not listening to the feedback. That's actual failure. The rest of it is just information. So don't be afraid of information. She's vanished. Was that like a yes/no answer that I also didn't quite manage, John?
So, sorry, I have to go and get a gadget for us.
No problem.
Do we have would you mind coming closer here?
Sure.
Do we perhaps have any questions from the audience, or where do we start first? And if you wouldn't mind, you would need to ask the question into the microphone so everybody in the audience can hear you. Okay, the enthusiasm.
Maybe everyone just wants
simmering.
coffee.
Yeah, you think so?
I don't know.
No. Come on, guys, girls. Oh, there you go. Peja, please ask it in the microphone.
Thank you. What I wanted to ask you is, I was triggered by this. You said that you are not too familiar, companies, or at least some people in companies don't like you because you say you just remove the middle layer. So what I was wondering is, you're going to a company. They say they want to be more agile, whereas it is obvious that actually they don't. They have some other agenda.
Yeah.
So what do you do at that point? Do you just say, no, forget it, I don't want to work with you? Or you say, okay, let's see what can be done?
Yeah.
Or something else?
I think it depends. The first thing that you always ask is, what are you really trying to achieve? I mean, what is the actual goal? What are you trying to do here? What problems are you trying to fix, whatever it is? If they really seem intent on fixing stuff, then there's room for negotiation and talking about what you can do. I mean, I never go into a company and say, fire half your staff. Most of what I do is about the people. I care way more about the people than I do about the organization. So I'm like, how can we better use these people? How can they be more fulfilled in their roles? Now, you do get people who are very fulfilled in having tight control over a small number of people as if they're like an emperor, because you get empire building within organizations. That's a model of legitimacy which needs to be changed at a systemic level. So if they're really serious about changing, you don't go and just get rid of people. What you do is you change the environment and you explore how willing they are to change their environment. If they're not willing to change the environment and they just want the words, then you know that they don't really want to change. And if I feel that that's big enough and there's not enough value I can add, then I will say I don't really think I'm going to be able to help you. I mean, we can try, but I suspect we're not going to get very far. I'm always honest about it.
Thank you, Chris. Do we have any other questions? Or you're pointing to someone, but I need to see to whom. Sorry? Your colleague? Anyone here? All the way there. Oh my goodness. Could you get any further? Thank you. Please tell us your name.
Thank you. My name is Igor. I made sure to ask the question where I'm the most far from the mic, so sorry for that. So my question was also about the mid-management layer. What happens if a company is really big? How would you actually organize it a really large company which has a lot of people? And how would you actually organize the teams? And what is the perfect team size to still remove this mid-management and have things flat, but also not have too many direct reports?
Ooh, there's some interesting questions there. So I don't think there's a perfect team size per se. I think it's more about the composition of the team. If you are working in a way that allows people to have that kind of empowerment, the enablement, the cross-functionality, the everything else, you just don't have the need for certain roles as much. Now, people can always try, there's no such thing as an I-shaped or T-shaped person. I mean, I'm annoyed with hearing that. There's no human on earth who only does one thing ever. We can all do multiple things, probably more than we realize. So within an organization, people will have multiple skills, and they may be able to work in different ways to benefit the organization. With middle management, it kind of really does depend on the people, what they're doing, why they're there. I can't remember which one it was in your slides, Nigel, that were the people who just existed to tell other people what to do. But if they're one of those, I don't know how much use there is for them. But it's that idea of repurposing, like you could call it exaptation, I guess, but you're repurposing people to benefit the organization in better ways. Now, that requires exploration. You have to test that kind of thing. And companies may or may not feel that there's risk in doing so. So that's a conversation you need to have with them.
Thank you, Chris. And I think we are sort of out of time.
No
You you're 1 minute away from coffee, so let's not
not get in the way of coffee.
Yeah. But we said there was going to be a question for the audience to ask.
Yes.
And I decided it's not going to be brutal or macabre.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
you're not going
it's-
for that one.
No, I'm not going for that. But I'm going for your personal record.
Okay.
You told me that you've increased your personal record.
Does anyone remember it from last year? I don't
Hopefully
know.
not.
Okay.
Let me make it more fun. Anyways, whoever remembers, Chris also does free diving. In our language, it's ronjenje na dach. And last year he had his own personal record, and this year the record is bigger, or longer, if you will. So do we want to...
Yeah, we can see. Don't go crazy. I'm not like some kind of professional free diver or something.
Wim Hof, that sort of stuff, huh?
Sorry.
Wim Hof, he does this sort of, but not for diving purposes,
yeah.
but breathing.
He does
not
ice
breathing.
diving. Like,
Well, right.
good luck to
You
him.
cannot do that in Boracay, for sure.
No.
Good. So the question is, and we get the answers directly to Chris, so not via the app. You just come up to Chris or to me. How many minutes, how many seconds, so it's minutes and seconds, can Chris manage underwater free diving without breathing? Yeah?
How long can I hold my breath
How long
in the
can Chris
water?
hold? Moving or not moving?
Static. 3:15.
3:15? Okay, we can do it right away. We don't need to
Yeah,
wait
we
for
can do it
after
right
the
away.
break.
3:15?
3:15?
Ooh, 7, that would be good.
Okay. 2:52?
2:52, okay.
4:22.
4:22 was close. It's pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting less close. Ooh, it's starting to get closer again. 4:17 was that? That's pretty close. It's nearly there.
Yeah, nearly there.
It's nearly
so
there.
the exact time is?
4 minutes, 15 seconds. Yeah. There you go. I think many people wish I could hold my breath for significantly longer, but...
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the participation.